Welcome to the second episode of The Next Decade, for which our guest is Michael Every, global strategist at Rabobank. In this episode, we discuss the shifting global economic order and the new geopolitical dynamics. We talk about grand macro strategy, what GDP is for actually, and not merely what GDP is, as well as how national security concerns now trump economic policy. If you want to gain the necessary framework for thinking about the next 10 years, from a political, geopolitical, and economic stance, this is the show. Also, let me do the inevitable. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share in whatever order you deem relevant. This is a new podcast after all, and followers growth is everything as you may imagine. Finally, nothing in this episode is financial advice. Everything shared by the host or the guest reflects personal opinions only. Always do your own research before making financial decisions. Michael Every, welcome to The Next Decade.
Thank you very much. Much to discuss.
Yeah, of course. If you don't mind, I'll do your bio for our audience. You are a global strategist at Rabobank, for which you write various in-depth macroeconomic and geopolitical analyses, which people can find on Rabobank's website. You have over 2 decades of experience working as an economist and a strategist for various financial institutions in various places around the world. In fact, you lived in 9 countries. Is that still up to date?
That's still up to date, as of today.
Nice. And where are you right now? Singapore or?
Yes.
Oh, Singapore. Okay, perfect. You're well known and fast-growing world of finance-related podcasts, as well as financial media such as MSNBC, Forbes, and Bloomberg. Namely, am I missing anything?
Only that I'm closer to 3 decades than 2 at the moment, but
right.
marginally. So you can do the math on that.
Perfect. I missed a decade. It's a bit far off, but okay. Before we dig into the geopolitical and grand strategy serious stuff, I just read right before we started recording actually an article in Forbes Australia for which we're interviewed. And you said something, I'm quoting you here. If you've read political theory and political history, the last thing you want to do is radicalize your middle class when your working class is already radicalized. End of quote. I think we forget that revolutions, since the 18th century at least, were to a large extent pushed forward by the bourgeois class, revolting as their own government, not so much the working class, although that sounds more romantic. Are we at that point today, where the middle class is radicalized and the petit bourgeois is essentially voting for Trump now?
Well, I think you can see that there. We had examples of that in many emerging markets before Trumpism emerged in the US. And it's one of the other reasons, besides a knowledge of history and sociology and political theory, that I said it. But it remains true. If you look at Western democracies, the working class obviously are not having the best time of it. That goes without saying. But to reiterate your point, that's not when you get turning points electorally or structurally. It's when the great middle class suddenly realizes that the system is no longer providing for them, or that their children will be worse off than they are, which is where we are now in many Western democracies. And the outcomes of that tend to be very, very radical policy shifts. Look around you. What do we see?
Yeah, essentially that. And it's true that for the first time in over a century, this generation will be less wealthy than the previous one from our parents, essentially, or my parents, I guess. You've mentioned in various interviews and in your writings that we have to start asking ourselves the question, what is GDP for, instead of merely what is GDP or what is the GDP, in the context of grand macro strategy for countries such as the US. Can you tell us, how do you define, first of all, grand macro strategy versus just macro strategy, and what is GDP for actually?
Thank you for the questions. So let's get back to basics. We all know what macro strategy is when we're talking about what we project GDP will be to 1.9, 1.8, etc. What will inflation be? This is the role traditionally of economists and economic policy, and politicians who don't really understand either echoing them, having had advice papers or position papers put on their desks by them. That's macro strategy. Grand strategy is something in the realms of national security or history. It used to be called statescraftship, or even all the way back to Plato's Republic. How to become a king or a monarch. How to rule a political entity. And of course, the economy is part of that, but it's not focused on the economy per se. It's focused on national power, national interests within a competitive international environment, a zero-sum international environment. So that's grand strategy. I believe we're in a world now which is more like the 19th century, again, much more contested, much more zero-sum, partly because of the reasons we just discussed, of the failure of the system to deliver for the middle class within the West, but also because of increased imbalances between countries internationally and the destabilization of the global power structure centered on the US, the military power structure. So as a result, large economies first, small economies second, are having to fuse macro strategy with grand strategy, and you get grand macro strategy, which is basically a modern spin on the old theme of what are we trying to do? What are our national interests? How do we achieve them? And in achieving them, we don't just say, what's GDP going to be next quarter? 1.9. We ask ourselves, what is our GDP for? Is our GDP driven, and I've used this example on many podcasts, is our GDP driven entirely by hairdressing, for example, which theoretically could happen. Everyone could put down all their tools and say, we all want to retrain as hairdressers tomorrow, the entire economy. Well, you'd have a boom in hairdryers and on, swivel seats and on mirrors. Would it leave you internationally in a better or worse position to be a country which said, we are the place everyone in the world comes to for a haircut, but we don't do anything else? And it may sound ludicrous, but most things are when you take them to an extreme. And that actually is a methodology of mine to see how stupid an argument is by taking it to an extreme. And if it breaks down, it's not a very good argument. So what is our GDP for? And the answer is most of our politicians still don't have an idea. Most of our leadership class don't have an idea. They understand vaguely that it needs to be more for the middle class now, and it needs to be more for the working class. They don't know how to do that internally, and they certainly don't understand how to do that externally in a competitive zero-sum environment. All the policy mantras they keep referring to, competitiveness, deregulation, etc., some of them have some elements that could work, free trade, but most of them actually don't anymore. They need to have a cohesive, coherent, internally consistent, grand macro strategy for what they want their GDP to be for in a contested world environment that will narrow internal gaps and multiply domestic strength, either individually or as part of a coalition. And very few countries have even begun to grapple with what that means. And I believe the US is one of them.
Before I move on to the next question, something you said, we could be all hairdressers and be just fine as long as GDP doesn't drop. For a while, at least throughout most of my life, when people talk about GDP, it was essentially, let's grow the GDP so GDP per capita also increases. Therefore, we're individually wealthier and the country as a whole is wealthier. And that was the end. Like the GDP growth was an end in itself. And now it seems to be GDP growth is not so much as important as, say, what is GDP producing, let's say tanks versus hairdressers. Is this a bit like, am I understanding you right or correctly?
Absolutely. When you are in an era of national security threats, which I think we can all agree is the case, what you are producing and who you are selling it to and what other people are producing and who you are buying it from is critical. And to reiterate, this is the oldest of theories, which I am attempting to sell to skeptical markets under a new package, if you will, or a new label. It's nothing new. It's just that for a generation since the early 1990s, and you could argue maybe even since the 80s, we have a cohort of economists and leadership globally who have just unlearned all of the key lessons of history. and you see the result around you.
Good point. It's difficult not to talk about Donald Trump nowadays, or perhaps ever since the mid 2010s, actually. But I was wondering, let's say Donald Trump would have lost the last presidential elections, and Kamala Harris would have been the president. Everything you mentioned before, to my extent, to my knowledge, or at least the way I interpret it, as structural, meaning it's there, whether Trump or not is there, we have the same issues. Would the policy have been that, or would the overall approach to statecraft that you said been the same under Harris, or will we have seen more maybe kicking the can down the road, or something else as a response to those structural problems that the U.S. is facing?
I think it would have been the same and different. The problems were recognized openly as exactly the same. How does the US retain its primary global position, deal with inequality at home, and strengthen its military arm in a contested world environment, particularly against a really incredibly powerful challenger like China, and working in collaboration with Russia and Iran and North Korea? How does it do that in a contested world? The difference would have been that the former Biden admin, and one presumes the Harris admin that would have been, had an idealist response to this, which is presuming that you do everything better in collaboration with others, and equally quite a pacifist one, which was that war doesn't solve anything, and that threatening people doesn't achieve anything. So it very rarely used military force itself. It was constantly trying to build bridges against that coalition, but it was deadly afraid of ever crossing any red lines that might trigger something happening. But they certainly used some economic statecraft tools like tariffs, for example, export controls, sanctions. We did see these things, particularly against Russia. The problem was, and is, with idealism, that everyone else has to be prepared to act with you. And for all of the nice meetings that happened with Europe, and of all the statements of support and like-mindedness and brotherhood, etc., no one did anything. And whether you do or don't agree with what Trump is doing, and I'm not taking a personal stance here, I'm absolutely not. I'm trying to look at it objectively as an analyst. Pivoting from idealism to radical realism, which is what the Trump administration has done, which is to say, these are our self-interests, and we will act in them, and we have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, effectively, but we will shift around as we have to in order to achieve these particular targets. So if we have to be more friendly with Russia, we'll be more friendly with Russia. If we have to just walk away from Europe, we'll walk away from Europe. Only by acting like that are we now seeing transformative change happen. So you may absolutely despair of the messenger, and many people do. You may despair of the way in which these things are being discussed, and many people do. But we are now starting to see transformative change happen. Now, that doesn't mean it will work, and that doesn't mean that things change for the better. But to answer your question and to loop back to it, whoever was running the US would have been faced with the same strategic dilemmas. If they'd gone for the idealist approach, a lot of people would be happier, shall we say. A lot of people within that middle class, the upper part of the middle class that we were referring to, would be far happier, but the underlying situation would not be getting any better. Things are now changing, and it remains to be seen for the better or the worse.
I'll fast forward to a question I had for later on, but let's say Trump technically should step aside in 2029. That's his second term. Let's just say J.D. Vance doesn't become president and the Democrats get back in power. Are we seeing a radical shift once again in American policy?
Well, I mean, if you look at one thing as a mirror to that, look at the Middle East. Under Obama, you had this radical shift away from US traditional policy there to suddenly say Iran, which hates the US and burns the American flag and calls it the big Satan all the time. They're our future friends in the region. And the region was just shocked to its core. Like, how can this possibly be US policy? But something for Europe and Canada to consider today, by the way, in terms of how things can flip with an election. Then Trump won, flipped all the way back and said, no, Iran's our enemy, blah, 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 etc. And we go back to the old book. Biden comes in, immediately takes the Houthis off the terrorist list, who then proceed to block the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, etc.
The US is about to attack the Houthis
and pivots back to Iran again. All the same people come back in. Trump comes back in, we're anti-Iran again. So you can have a huge pivot on one area. You could potentially see a huge pivot, but I don't think it will change the fact that China is central to the US thinking. And the only issue then becomes, again, are we idealist in building a coalition? Are we realist or not? But what's important is, after having had, now it will be 2 terms of Trump, the second one much more transformative than the first, is anyone going to believe US idealism, knowing that at any point 4 years down the line, realism can come back and everything can be blown up? I think it will produce a logical, realist response from everybody else, including in the West and Canada. The issue is, within the realm of realism, what is realistic? What is actually feasibly realistic, even if you don't like what Trump is doing, given the world that he's created by saying we can act thus? And that's a very important discussion not enough people are having.
It seems common knowledge now that we've entered a new era. Some call it post-Cold War, post-Pax Americana. But I always find it difficult to really say when a period or a historical period ends and then one begins and why it is so. Is Trump's first election in 2016, or maybe even his second, his latest, 2024, 2025, really a break in between 2 historical periods? Or is there another shift or another event, I should say, that provoked that historical change in eras?
Well, future historians will argue or debate. Yeah. That's what historians do. I think you can make a very credible argument. Things began to go wrong right at the beginning of the 2000s, when you had, first of all, the first great, American crash, economic crash with the tech bubble bursting. And then you had the Iraq War and the war on terror at the same time, which alienated a lot of the world and displayed that the US economy wasn't as strong as we thought. Certainly then you had the GFC, the global financial crisis, which again really opened people's eyes around the world to the fact that again, the Western economy was nowhere near as strong as people thought it was. And B, when that bubble burst, the West broke every single one of the rules that it imposes on emerging markets when they have crony capitalism driven asset bubbles, and bailed out all the people who created the crisis in the first place and punished nobody. So all the rules of the IMF, the World Bank, etc., which the West has rammed down the world's throats as part of the liberal world order, they broke every single one of those rules to line their own pockets after the GFC. So, the frustration and alienation at the double standards that began then only grew. And then, of course, you had a notable policy shift in China to take advantage of that frustration and that disillusionment, shall we say, and lack of US economic leadership to a degree. The Obama administration, as I said, was radical in the Middle East, and it began a process of saying we're disengaging. It genuinely did, even if people don't see that. Historically, I think you can see it. And of course, Trump just exacerbated that, as did Brexit during that 2017 epoch, 16, 17. And then, of course, Biden continued what Trump did. And now Trump, I think, will probably be the nail in the coffin here, barring some very unfortunate or unexpected, unexpected, not unfortunate, very unexpected development. But people will argue exactly when, but certainly that's where we are now.
And what will the world look like by 2029 when Trump's term is over?
I mean, throw a dart at a board. I think it's more important to actually recognize what the US is trying to achieve, which many people don't. And when you have a mental map of what you think it may be doing, and this is purely hypothetical, it's not a forecast, then you start looking at the reality of what could or couldn't be achievable within it. And then you get into the loop of what if others do X, Y, or Z in response. And then, of course, you have infinite future paths. But we've published papers on this, hypothetical ones in the past, and it looks like a much more fractured world, but it's still likely to be one where most of the Western alliance is with the US, but not as this liberal world order, fraternal alliance of co-partners, because it was never that. The US was always doing almost all the heavy lifting, at least in recent years. But with the US basically saying, when we jump, you will ask how high. And if you don't like that, you can be a lot poorer than you are now. Those are your two choices. That's one start. That's one likely future. And the other one is all against all, at which point smaller countries will be much poorer. So those, I would argue, are logically the two most likely outcomes.
Can this be a wake-up call, though, for Europe and Canada also? The fact that the US, who's been, as you said, lifting most of the weights so far, is kind of telling them we cannot afford to do all the heavy lifting anymore, so you have to pay your fair share, so to speak. We can see it in Europe right now as they're talking about beefing up defense spending. Whether they can actually do it or not is something else. In Canada, it's taking more time for us to get our stuff together, but we're kind of understanding that the world is changing slowly, but it's getting there. And I already hear it around me. People are saying maybe we'll thank Donald Trump soon enough because he's woken us to what was inevitable ultimately. So maybe in 4 years, on 2029, the world will be a more, or at least Canada and Europe will be more independent towards the US, and the relationship will be a saner one too.
Well, possibly. Let's look at the upside. People generally don't do things until they're shocked. I wish that leadership listened to people with outsider voices, to be blunt, like my own for most of my career, and said, yeah, we can see the fat tail risks there, and history suggests they're far more likely than we would perceive them to be. So we'd better do something precautionary just in case. They don't. Everyone's got short-term end quarter thinking, either looking at what GDP is going to be irrelevantly, or what share prices are going to be doubly irrelevantly. In the larger scheme of things. I understand share prices are important, but not quarter to quarter in the way that we look at them, right? So you are seeing a policy response in Europe. You're seeing radical change being floated in Europe and starting to happen. You are seeing, from what I understand, and you're far better placed than me, equivalent discussions happening in Canada. What I have to be crystal clear about is the scale of the change is staggering. It's not something marginal. It will change, again, hypothetically, so much in terms of how one understands one's own political economy. Because to circle back to something I said earlier, in the Canadian case and the European case, people are starting to echo what I've been arguing for a while. What is GDP for? Europe just gave orders to every household in Europe to stockpile 3 days' food and water. Now, I think that's an exaggeration. I don't think someone living in Portugal is going to worry about stockpiling 3 days' food and water because of something that may happen in Eastern Europe. But that's the suggestion coming out from Brussels. Does this not change your conception of how you operate and how you live and how you invest, and make you ask your politicians what sectors of the economy we're prioritizing and not, and what mechanisms we have for doing that? For example, does one interest rate fit all? How do you prioritize some sectors of the economy which are low profitability but important for national security versus others which are high profitability but undermine national security? How do you send those incentives for profits versus national security? These are fundamental philosophical questions of political economy. Vastly more than just saying we're going to spend 2.1% of GDP on defense versus the almost nothing which you spend in Canada in real terms. You buy almost no equipment. But even if we put it on that simple metric, just defense spending as a share of GDP, I mean, does Canada understand what would be required to defend the Arctic? When you have, an expansionary Russia bordering that area, which is of critical importance for national security for everyone, including the US, where you have China claiming itself to be an Arctic power too and getting involved, and where you have the US displaying interest in Greenland, etc., and bordering it too. So you've got 3 of the world's biggest powers, all nuclear armed, interested in territory in which you have no ability to project power whatsoever. So, Canada may be waking up. I'm not sure how much it's waking up vis-a-vis the reality, as I was saying, the actual physical reality of the situation. And then the conception of what that actually means can be done about it. Because I'm pulling a number from thin air here. I'm not pretending to have done the math on it, but I understand intuitively the numbers we're talking about. You could be talking about spending 5, 6, 7% of GDP on defense and having conscription on the Swiss or Israeli model to start talking about having a military that really could, in a worst case scenario, say, yeah, we can defend against multiple threats like that. I'm not saying anyone will. It's not a forecast. I'm not saying you should. But if this is the reality of the world around you, what are your policy options? If you can't do that, and that's what would be required hypothetically in one scenario, what are the other paths when you look at military statecraft, economic statecraft, and political statecraft? And I'm saying this just after, of course, Prime Minister Carney, overnight, as we're recording this, in Asia, our time, or this morning when we woke up, said that the old relationship with the US is dead. It's over. There's no longer that close political, economic, and military integration. What does that mean for the USMCA? What does that mean for Canada's physical defense if it's not the US? What does it mean for Canada's economic future if Trump also said, just before Carney spoke, if Canada looks to Europe and tries to do something to hurt the US, and that, you've had suggestions Canada could even join the EU, some people are floating that, he will tariff the hell out of both blocks, or that new bloc, on an even more aggressive level. So everything's in motion. Everything is quote unquote possible. All the old certainties are crumbling. But the realities of what may or may not be possible to do, once the dust starts to settle, need to be clearly focused on, I think. And that is, again, grand macro strategy. What is your grand strategy? What is macro feasible within that? And what are your possible market outcomes as a result?
It would seem that all candidates in the current Canadian electoral process are essentially saying the same thing. So we have to, in my opinion, wait until the election's over. We know who forms the, hopefully, or maybe, majority government, and then we'll see what kind of real relationships we're starting to rebuild with the Americans. But I think right now, Poilievre, who's leading the Conservative Party, is saying exactly the same thing right now. So I think that's electoral speech, in my opinion. But based on what you just said, it seems, I was about to say, it sounds a little bit like statism, but that's not what I meant, is that the state is essentially now increasingly telling the private sector what to do, when to do it, and how to spend their money. Because, as you said, however profitable a hairdresser is, won't stop the Russians from invading from the north. So is this where we're going? A sort of economy where the state, even in so-called free market economies or free-ish market economies like Canada, US, Europe, the state is essentially, or increasingly, I should say, telling the private sector how to spend their money and where to invest their money?
Yes, this is something I've been fleshing out, again, as a hypothesis, a theoretical framework, which is what I do, alongside my colleagues who then make, real world forecasts, adapting elements of that, or at least as risk spectrum forecasts along those lines. I've been trying to flesh this idea out. Let me share it with you. It's very, very simple. And, you can quibble around the edges, but I sometimes think logical constructs work best rather than mathematical ones with variables we can't control for. If you define capitalism at its simplest, you could say it's private capital for private goals. So do what you want. If we define communism, most simply, it's state capital for state goals. If we define crony capitalism, or kleptocracy, most simply, it's state capital for private goals. You're robbing everyone's system for yourself. And if you look at anything from defined as corporatism to fascism, it's private capital for state goals.
Which sounded a bit like what I just said.
Yes, that's exactly why I bring it up. So whether this falls on the fascism element, at its extreme, or it's corporatism of some sort, this is what I believe more and more economies outside China, which has a very efficient system itself already, very, very well-defined system. Everyone in the West is working out, how do we get the dynamism of the private sector, which we don't want to lose, but how do we make sure the private sector understands, and again, I'm not having a go at hairdressers, I need a haircut actually, but how do we make sure that people understand that some things matter for GDP, or GDP needs to be for more than just making a profit, without removing the profit incentive, which creates the dynamism within the system and the freedoms which we associate with the West? How do we do that? No one has the answer yet, but we're seeing different emerging models. We're seeing centralizing approaches in some countries around central banks and new technologies emerging. And in others, in the US case, what we very clearly see is a decentralizing model, but behind tariff barriers. So the US model is going to be, there's a sky-high tariff to get in. There's no taxation or paperwork once you're inside. I mean, that still won't be enough to address every national security issue. I'm sure the state will have to play a role somewhere. And potentially, very hypothetically, you could go the purely private sector model and saying, okay, we'll keep the military, but say, for example, we'll start hiring mercenaries rather than paying for an army. It's like, we'll just take tax revenue and just say, we need this problem sorted out. Whoever can do it, here's a pot of cash. You go and do it.
It's been done already.
There are ways to do it that are kind of sympathetic with a libertarian view, if you can, if you put it that way. I'm not saying that will happen again. I'm just fleshing out logical boxes and frameworks. But everyone is looking now at how do we square this circle? And those who are at the forefront of that discussion, I think are best placed to understand what the economy will look like, location by location, within the realities of what they can do, and therefore what financial markets will look like. So if you have, a completely freewheeling approach in one area, it will look like this. A state-driven approach, it will look like that. And just to give you one final point, just as evidence of this, besides the 25% auto tariffs that Trump has just brought in, starting next week as we're speaking, which have seen meltdown in Canada, despite the fact, if you read the text of the executive order, it says anything that's USMCA compliant does not have a 25% tariff. So if it's an entirely North American supply chain, no tariff, which is part of the US statecraft here, being overlooked. Trump also said he doesn't want US automakers to raise prices. So now, whether or not he can do that, whether or not they do or don't, is a different issue. But can you see a direction of travel? And it's not one of just costs plus business models, which is how financial markets have been set up for a long time in a liberal world order environment where, Fortune magazine, Bloomberg, Financial Times were what everyone read rather than foreign policy, foreign affairs, or the Institute of Strategic Studies, etc., etc. Different worlds.
Different world. We've been talking about the US quite a bit, but very few people are, maybe because Trump is so omnipresent right now, but very few people are asking the question, what is the grand strategy of China? And it feels to me like that's the next big question we need to ask ourselves. What is China's grand strategy?
Well, again, they've been relatively transparent on that. If you read past policy papers, they have an incredibly effective system where you have, the most productive features of some elements of capitalism alongside an enormous state role. And 100% you have what is a grand macro strategy of increasing China's footprint across every global supply chain and every liberal world order institution, such that, Chinese authority and position within them grows and grows to the point where effectively China becomes to dominate more and more of them. So let me give you one statistic. In the year 2000, 6% of manufactured goods globally were made in China. 6. That's pre-WTO entry. The projection from the UN, and I no longer think we're on this path, but the projection pre-recent Trump orders was by 2030, China would make 45% of manufactured goods. Now, if you use my methodology of just keep projecting things forward, and it will tell you when something is not sustainable as a result, by 2040, where do you think we would be? 75? Possibly. By 2050, where are you? 80? 90? At what point does China make everything? Or almost everything? Now, is that sustainable? Clearly not from a national security perspective, because the large players like the US in particular will say, we can no longer make F-35s or aircraft carriers without inputs from China. What if we can't get them? Then we don't have any military power. If we don't have any military power, the key pillar underpinning the liberal world order is gone. Because while everyone likes the liberal world order, and countries in Europe, very much so, and not having a go, but very much Canada, presumed it was the attractiveness of the liberal world order that made it sustainable, rather than US military muscle behind it, saying to everyone like the Houthis, if you muck around with this, we'll blow you up. And notice as soon as the US stopped doing that, the people like the Houthis did appear and did start mucking around with the liberal world order and close down the Suez Canal, which is kind of important and doesn't get enough focus. People didn't realize that. So it was never sustainable because someone was at some point going to say this can't go any further. And then the problem is, to come back to your question about China, what do you do when you have a model which is based on growing exports faster than your economy when people won't absorb them?
That's China's issue at this moment, that they're so efficient at exporting that at some point there's no market to export to anymore, or it's saturated though.
Well,
So that's the biggest issue?
That would happen if the US and Europe as two large blocks, and Canada, for example, which is looped into this, because Canada currently doesn't have tariffs on China, mainly, one or two things, but mainly it doesn't. Very clearly, the US wants Canada to follow its lead, and Europe. All of them are resisting because they're so integrated with those supply chains, and they understand that once you burn that bridge, it doesn't come back, and you head for global bifurcation. And if you're free trading, freewheeling Europe and Canada, we want to be friends, and we have issues over here, but we still want to trade with you. You can't go down that bifurcation route, but then the US won't let you not go down that route. This is one of the big standoffs that really everything we're seeing is about in the US and Europe, and the US vis-a-vis Canada. I'm telling you, this is what it's actually about. If you look at it through a statecraft lens, and I stress that's my job, that's what I'm doing. I'm not making a forecast. I have to keep qualifying that, right? But if you look at that lens, that's what it's about. So that's not an issue for China today. Their grand strategy is to continue doing what they've been doing, and it's working very well. But they have to be prepared for the fact, because they do look forward, they can see these things, that within, X number of months or years, potentially the thing or the world around them changes, and then they have to start thinking, what do they do? And then they will be addressing new issues strategically. How do we cope with the fact that we're too efficient?
Which leads me to my next question. What will be China's response to essentially Trump's tariffs and perhaps even aggrandizing alliance? Let's say the United States convinces Canada to impose tariffs themselves on China, maybe Mexico too, maybe Europe, as you just said. China will respond sooner or later. They already have with their own tariffs on certain things, I believe. But ultimately, next 6 months to a year, let's just say, what can we expect from China as a response to US measures that are making the news right now?
Well, again, I'm not going to forecast what they will do because that's not my job. My job is to look at the hypothetical range of scenarios of what they could do, looking at the world a certain way. And clearly, you have a spectrum from the very mild to the very extreme. I mean, this is logical. And at the very mild level, you just you offer complaints, or you try and persuade people to shift from one camp to the other by temporarily opening your market. For example, saying suddenly we want everything that Canada makes in this area, because they're currently tariffing some Canadian products, as you're aware. Suddenly those tariffs disappear and they place a bulk order. Great, free trade is back. You've won. Well, not really. You've been coaxed out of one camp temporarily into another in order to break that putative hypothetical alliance. That would be one end, which I can assure you many people will immediately fall for because they do every time China play that particular card. At the complete other extreme, of course, you have saber rattling. We've had a Chinese cruiser sail past Australia and New Zealand who are part of this discussion as well, whether they like it or not, in a similar position to Canada, except their distance from the US is further. What was that going around there for? Why did you have a cruiser and a destroyer and potentially a submarine underwater protecting them just off the coast of Sydney? Tourism? No, it's clearly an indicator of where things could go at the worst case, other extreme. And in the middle, somewhere between the two, you have China saying, well, suddenly there's a problem with the supply of this key component that you need. All your industry is still running on this widget or this piece of wire or this input, which we have. We make 80% of. You don't control the supply chain. and suddenly we're short, we can't send it to you, and your economy hits the buffers. So those are your range of outcomes. And then you get into game theory about, okay, what does each player do in that particular scenario? But it comes down to fairly simple options. At the end of the day, when you resolve it, which is you do something about it and you continue to move supply chains so that threat doesn't exist, which reorders the world, or you don't, and you go back to a scenario which is the status quo ante, which is effectively you just say we can't rock the boat, and so that current Chinese strategy is superior to the West's and wins. If you plot it all out in your head hypothetically. And again, I'm not saying what will happen. I want to keep repeating that because no one can tell you what will happen. But you need to have a consistent understanding of the game being played. And if that game doesn't change, these are the potential moves the pieces can make.
You're building scenarios here from most likely to least likely, or at least from mild to extreme. Is one of those scenarios a trade war transforming to a kinetic war, a proper war?
Look, I'm not making that as a call, and I have to keep saying that again, but it's certainly something that the US keeps talking about. The US itself, politicians, think tanks, etc., continue to stress that they see that as a risk. And purely hypothetically, you couldn't rule it out, but you can't rule anything out hypothetically. And this is one of the issues when you're doing traditional macro strategy rather than grand macro strategy, which is what I'm talking about. If you're doing macro strategy, where do you encompass the risk of a particular trade action ending up in something kinetic? You don't, because you can't factor it in. You're an economist. It doesn't enter your Excel spreadsheet. Ergo, if you're a politician, should you be listening to someone like that as a policy advisor? No. No, not when you've got those kind of tail risks. They can be very useful for computing what the inflationary impact of a particular policy might be. I mean, there's a large margin of error given you don't know what exchange rates will do, what the second, third, fourth order effects will be, etc. But as a first order static effect, listen to them, of course, but don't base your fundamental policy stance on an ideological assumption behind the models, which is these things don't happen because they're not in our models.
Let's move to second tier powers, at least what I call second tier powers, like Canada and EU. We talked quite a bit about the two already, but again, scenarios from mild to extreme, least likely to most likely. By 2035 or something along those lines, or in that era, is it more likely, or where do you put, let's say, Canada becoming the United States or being annexed by the United States, or Canada and Mexico and the US forming a sort of North American European Union where it's essentially one big market versus the United States maybe taking over Canada?
Well, again, I want to be abundantly clear.
You're not making a call, but
yeah, I'm not making a call, and neither am I going to assign distinct likelihood, unlikelihood to things, purely because that's making a call in a way. If you say, here's an option, but it's 0.0001% chance of happening, you're basically saying it won't happen. I do, having said that, think it's staggeringly unlikely that Canada becomes the 51st state for many, many reasons, and I'm sure Canadians understand them perfectly well. But if you understand Trump's traditional rhetoric, which is A, throw a grenade into the room to blow up all, perceived norms and shift the Overton window by removing the window and the wall and the roof, and then start a discussion, it does appear logical, not probable, but logical, that the US goal is, as I said, an expanded and deepened USMCA, where the US is much more dominant within it. For example, saying we want this area of the value chain in this particular sector. We need this to start with, and trading that off for, an EU-style common external tariff, which of course technically would be written by all three, but in reality would be written by the US. And if you look at that, that does imply loss of economic sovereignty for Canada or Mexico. Of course it does, as it does in Europe. Germany and France don't have economic sovereignty because they can't set their own trade policy. Europe does that. So the ironic thing there, again, hypothetically, is that you'd be talking about someone who hates the EU, Donald Trump, proposing a North American equivalent in a way, but just without any of the social or cultural trappings. It would be just much more in terms of this is a laissez-faire union with strict border security. I don't think that's going to change, and I don't think there'll be free movement. Although over time, you could possibly make the argument that may happen with Canada. There might be a GDP per capita. I'm sorry?
Not Mexico, though.
No. I'm sure there might be like a GDP per capita threshold. Like if Mexico ever gets to here in GDP per capita, then we can start talking about it, etc., etc. But as it stands, you can't see that flying. But it would be largely a very deregulated, and again, that would involve Canada deregulating, because there's a lot of regulation within Canada between provinces, which I understand is now being discussed. But equally, alongside within the US, like deregulation, behind one unified bloc. And that's logical from a statecraft perspective, because let me just stress the alternative from a US statecraft perspective. If you're sitting in Washington, D.C., thinking like this is a board game, for global hegemony, and Canada and Mexico won't sign up for that. They adamantly refuse. We are not going to be part of that. It doesn't look good for Canada or Mexico. It's existential to the US from a grand strategy perspective to turn around and say, well, if you're not with us, you're against us. This is not new. And I would urge anyone thinking this is ridiculous or hyperbole to go back and read the classics. The Melian Dialogue. You're familiar with what I'm talking about? Yeah. This is the Melian Dialogue in 2025. It doesn't have to end like that. I certainly hope it doesn't. I mean, not just literally in terms of what happened to Milos, but I mean, it doesn't have to end that badly. But one has to recognize that when you're dealing with a very large power, which is turning around now in a self-interested, realist, realpolitik way and saying, we see the world like this, there are limits to what one can then turn around and say, well, we don't see it like that because we think this is still the liberal world order, because it probably isn't.
Just to refresh my own mind and maybe the audience mind, the Melian Dialogue, essentially Athens going to Milos, the small Milos, city, Milos, small city state during the Peloponnesian War, and saying, either you're with us or you're with Sparta, and you cannot stand this. If you're neutrally essentially against us, and therefore Melius says, we're willing to take our chances and we'll resist whatever offer you're bringing, and Athens torches the city.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and basically, I'm simplifying. A classicist would be horrified at the reductivity of it. But effectively, you can't just turn around and say, we've never been your enemy. We wish you well, but we're free to do what we want. Because a greater power will be paranoid and will say, we can't have that. At the very least, forget about the torching and, the old world nastiness. If Canada or Mexico or whomever won't put tariffs on China, the US can't have free trade with them if it tariffs China. The logic of that is so crystal clear, I'm just constantly shocked people can't see it, because transshipment will happen in the same way that right now Europe doesn't allow some goods to flow to Russia and willingly allows them to flow to Kyrgyzstan, which sells them to Russia. Where is the statecraft logic in that? Other than saying I'm grandstanding, that I'm, taking this stance against this country here, which threatens me existentially, but all my companies want to keep making the same profits as usual. And how's Europe doing versus Russia, by the way?
Not that well.
In that particular instance. Now, it's an open question, but they're not winning, I wouldn't say. No? So the US, I don't think, will be prepared to militarily or strategically make that same error. And the Trump White House sends every signal to me, neutrally, directly, but neutrally, of saying, yeah, we're not going to allow this transshipment. And if you look at the details of recent executive orders, for example, they are talking about Canadian transshipment. They are talking about Mexican transshipment. And I really think that's far more important than it's being played up, by the press.
Let's move away from, let's say, grand macro strategy and down to I want to say the worker's view of the world, the salaried man view of the world. Because when the world changes, it changes differently. Yeah, exactly. It changes differently whether you're a C-suite executive, an investor on Wall Street, or a salaried man working in a, let's say, small city away from large urban centers. Is there a way for, I want to say, the average person to prepare and anticipate big macro changes, geopolitical changes, in order to at least not suffer the full consequences when the consequences are bad, or maybe even profit when things go better and well, or we doomed to suffer what we must.
You came up with the quote exactly. In reality, all of us are in that boat to an extent. In that, when I speak to clients and stakeholders, large and small, around the world in different geographies, I get given that message: what can we do? What can I do? And I hear that from an individual cattle farmer, for example, or a dairy farmer. I hear that from a small business owner. I hear it from the CEO of a large business. I even hear it from, the chairperson of a large industry association in the US, covering multiple businesses in critical sectors. Everyone always says, well, what can we do? And my reply to all of them is, you can do something. Individually, you can look at your own balance sheet and you can look at your own inputs and outputs and try to understand this, or read Rabobank research to try and help you frame it, because you shouldn't have to do all that heavy lifting yourself. That's what we're here for. But you can get on the phone to friends, to industry colleagues, to industry associations, to politicians, and say, look, you may not see things like this because you're listening to an economist who doesn't understand them, but we see things like this, and we'd like to discuss X, Y, Z with you to try and marginally move the needle where you can. That's one thing. But secondly, and trying to put some optimism in this world of national security, I think we can all agree that's where we are when Europe says, please buy 3 days worth of food and water. Whether you think that's ridiculous or not, they've said it. Historically, countries have had to rally around the flag and realize that means offering their population a better deal. When you look at the percentage figures showing you how many people of nationality X, Y, Z would be prepared to fight for their country in the current environment, they're embarrassingly low. The last ones I saw, something like 15 to 20% of Brits, I'm British by the way, are prepared to fight for Britain below the age of 30. 15 to 20, something like that. You can quibble. Historically it would have been 15 to 20 who wouldn't. Historically. So you've managed to flip it so the majority of young people feel so disconnected from society and from the deal they're being offered economically, politically, culturally, socially, that they don't have any interest. And again, I'm not making a forecast. I'm looking back at parallels and suggesting that these may be patterns that repeat in some way, in some form. Historically, governments have realized we must do better. We cannot just say, build back better while lying through our teeth. I don't want to be emotive about it. How many governments said build back better? How many international institutions said build back better post-COVID? Did anyone build back better anywhere? Can you point to me any build back bettering that happened? No, but everyone said it because it was nice rhetoric. Well, now you want people to physically put their children in the firing line, potentially. Or at least get in uniform and get out there to try and prevent that happening. Or at least persuade populations in democracies that this is the risk in order to restructure the economy, which is more likely the case, but all of them are on the table. What are you offering? What are you offering your population? So I'm trying to say that as some kind of light at the end of the tunnel, because we have volatility in front of us. We have uncertainty. We have a great deal of unpleasantness. But historically, provided things shake out the right way, and that's a larger picture none of us are in control of, it will involve people being offered a better deal, I think, a more inclusive deal. But that has huge ramifications, again, for labor versus capital, for deflation versus inflation, for asset prices, for equity prices, for currencies, for trading patterns, for which business sectors do well and which ones don't. And this is, again, fundamentally grand macro strategy, not macro strategy.
All of it seems like I want to say bearish for financial markets, though, in a way.
I think it's bearish for markets if you understand them in a desperately shallow way that the likes of Bloomberg, etc., look at them today. As someone who's been on trading floors on and off for over 25 years, it's difficult for people to understand how brilliant some of the people involved are. Truly, truly brilliant. And yet how collectively stupid markets are. They're brilliant at understanding price. They're terrible at understanding value. They have no interest in that whatsoever. That's a political issue where value lies, not price. And if you have markets that believe it's all about when do we get the next rate cut, and therefore when do house prices or stock prices go up, which at heart is how nearly all of the market still thinks, it's bearish for that view, because that's no longer what flies. If you have a country under a national security threat, and again, all a hypothesis, keep repeating that, but if you do, turning around and saying, we have overpriced housing, lads. None of you can ever afford to rent or buy a home. Now follow me. What does that do for you? Nothing whatsoever at all. So you need to start thinking, what's GDP for if you are thinking about national security? And that does give you an indication for where you may get upside and where you may get downside, but it isn't your traditional advice you get every quarter, every month, every week, every day, every hour, whatever, through in your inbox, talking about, this has gone slightly below the 200-day moving average, and now we think it's going to take a bounce, etc., etc. Because
I get those emails.
Exactly, so do I. And it's a different conceptual, and some of them are very clever and some of them are not. I'm offering a different conceptual framework, which is longer term rather than shorter term. People may see no value in it. That's absolutely fine. That's what makes a market. I'm not telling anyone what to do with their money. I've never done that and I never would. I'm trying to give people a different set of lenses to look at the world and to try and understand what may or may not happen. And it's up to you if you see value in that. That's the only value I'm trying to offer here, rather than anything else.
Lastly, you were critical of the use or abuse of the term geopolitical analysis by various people. Nowadays, the word has become very popular in the last few years, I want to say. How can one do great geopolitical analysis, either for oneself as an investor or a company even?
Well, again, read my work. I'm sorry. Had to do a little bit of self-promotion there. I mean, obviously, there are people out there worth listening to. But if you want to do it independently, and I'm always in favor of everyone learning to do everything they can intellectually, independently, that's the way the world should be. Read the classics. Read the classics. They were all about statecraft and political economy.
Such as?
Well, all the way back to Plato's Republic, just about anything written in the classical era in terms of how does one run an economy? What is society for? We were talking about the Melian dialogue. This is the era in which many of these questions were first framed, and they're still taught at West Point today. These issues don't go away. Read Machiavelli. Read all the great European thinkers from the past, von Clausewitz, for example. Read all these strategic thinkers. Don't read how to get rich next quarter, self-help books, from authors who are here today, gone tomorrow, or just irrelevant articles in the financial press. Understand the fundamental principles of play and then do your reading on top, and you'll be well placed, I believe.
Perfect. Good advice. Where can we follow you? Read your work, obviously, at Rabobank website. Listen to you as well.
Well, Rabobank Knowledge, have a look there. You'll see my work and my colleagues' excellent work on many of these and other fields. Some of my work is available on LinkedIn intermittently. And feel free to join the conversation on X, where I'm at the Michael Every, all one word, the Michael Every. And happy to continue the conversation there too.
Michael Every, thank you. Last word, maybe?
Well, we've discussed so much. I'm trying to think of a pithy comment. Other than that, these are very interesting times that we live in, and
True.
the more intelligent conversations like this that we can have, I think the better it is for everybody. So I do encourage everyone to get involved rather than to sit there at home saying, wow, this is just too much to deal with. I completely understand how people feel in that environment, but it doesn't take that much work to really get to the simple fundamental core of what may be going on, and then to start to build upwards from there. Because the alternative is either just to ignore everything, which doesn't work out too well, or just to be completely depressed about the whole thing, which, is a solution as well, but it's not the best one. So I would say, try and dive into the subject, get back to the fundamental principles of it. And I think you can see that on that basis, there is hope.
Good advice on that note. Thank you again, Michael Every.
Thank you. Have a great day.